maybe soon. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this event, which is the second event in the VCU Research Weeks series, which we started this week. My name is Christina Stancho. I'm an associate professor of English and the director of the Humanities Research Center here at VCU. And for those of you who don't know who we are, we started about 9 years ago, and our dean in the College of Humanities and Sciences, Catherine Gracia, who will give a few remarks after me, led that effort. And I've been doing this job for about 2.5 years. Last year, we were very happy to be designated a university-wide center. And my main job, and I keep saying that this is the best job on campus, is really to promote the work of students, faculty, locally, nationally, and maybe internationally, or more internationally. I'd like to thank the Office of the Vice President for Research and Innovation, as well as the Office of the Provost for this opportunity to co-organize this event. And I'd like to say thank you for recognizing the central role that the humanities play, both in the university's Strategic Research Priorities Plan and the training of undergraduates for future careers that haven't really been invented yet. So thank you. Now, in recent months, you may have read alarmist articles or social media posts about AI, ChatGPT, or the death of the humanities. How many people, just by a show of hands? Okay, oh, all of you, just for people on Zoom, most of the audience. Evidence suggests, however, to paraphrase Mark Twain, that these reports are greatly exaggerated. The humanities have a great momentum at this institution and are more visible now than ever before on this campus. For example, our audience at our first Meet VC Authors this semester, which featured the work of Mangala Subramaniam and Cristina Alcalde, had over 240 registrants and over 160 people were in the audience. If you care about numbers, our speaker series events, such as the recent one on food sovereignty with Malik Yakini, held here in this room, bring together faculty, students, and community members to explore topics of crucial interest. And as I know many of you know, this year the focus at the center has been environmental humanities. Next year we're moving to health humanities. The work of our colleagues contributes to our university's research mission by preserving pasts, inventing futures, collaborating with other disciplines, and, if I may say, perhaps a little optimistically, making the world better. Just this month, a couple of days ago, in fact, Dr. Christopher Ewing received an NEH Summer Stipend Award. Several colleagues have received Fulbright Awards. Dr. Brooke Newman was recognized for serving as lead researcher for The Guardian's investigation of British monarchy's ties to slavery. And just a few weeks ago, our humanities, environmental humanities lab received a significant grant from Virginia Humanities. So a lot of great things are happening. Last year, I just wanted to tell you a few more things about what we did. We organized a symposium, an international symposium in Germany. We started 2 new labs at the center, environmental humanities and health humanities. And then this fall, we are planning for 5 more on themes ranging from memory studies. I see the future director over here. There she is, Katie Logan. From memory studies to critical AI, to graphic narratives. Bernard Means is here, who is leading that effort, migration studies, and one of my most important items on the agenda, public humanities, really bringing public humanities to the fore. I think it's time for us. So the grassroots efforts of a faculty working group at the HRC on land acknowledgement in the last couple of years has led to the charge of a 1 VCU task force on land acknowledgement this year, and I thank the provost for doing that. And I'm immensely grateful to all our colleagues for their energy and and dedication. I have one more thing to say, and then I'll turn it over to Catherine. Although we have a long way to go to achieve the same type of institutional recognition as STEM fields, I'm very grateful to Dean Ingrassia, to VPRI Sriram Rao, and to Provost Sotiropoulos that we do not measure research impact only by research dollars from federal grants. And don't get me wrong, those are very important dollars. But we also measure the impact of our research on improving the human condition, our students' meaningful career pathways, enrich lives, our communities through civic engagement, as well as our personal reflection and enrichment as a society. And I could say more and more about this, but I'll stop here and I'll turn it over to someone who is way more eloquent than me, a fellow humanist and interim dean of the College of Humanities and Sciences, Dr. Catherine Ingrassia.
Thanks, Christina. Thank you, Christina. I'm delighted to welcome everyone here and online for Dr. Johnson's lecture, which is a terrific example of the interdisciplinarity that defines both the College of Humanities and Sciences and Virginia Commonwealth University as a whole. The fact that the OVPRI is co-sponsoring this lecture with the HRC is a testament to both the appropriately expansive vision of research held by Sriram Rao, Provost Sotiropoulos, and the institution as a whole. As Christina has wonderfully detailed, the humanities at VCU, through the energies of the College of Humanities and Sciences, and particularly the HRC, has increased the opportunities for collaboration and the visibility of the humanities. But equally important, the recognition of the need for the humanities has been increasingly evident. If we look at the talks throughout VCU's research weeks, we see woven through many of their titles and subjects the fulsome integration of the humanities concerns broadly conceived. Indeed, our keynoter on Monday, Dr. Terry Sanjowski, certainly one of the pioneers of neurobiology, not only drew on scholars in the humanities like Noam Chomsky, but also in the Q&A eloquently spoke of the foundational role humanity and the humanities must play in the development of things like ChatGPT and other AI-shaped developments. Dr. Johnson's talk this afternoon promises a similar recognition of the centrality of the humanities in the future we are facing. When I read the subtitle of Dr. Johnson's talk, The Ethical Governance of Innovation, I immediately thought of the touchstone literary text of the early 19th century, familiar to most of us, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Though reductively presented in cinematic representation, her novel's title character speaks passionately about the powerful allure of technological exploration when he says, quote, "None but those who have experienced them can conceive of the enticements of science. In a scientific pursuit, there is continual food for discovery and wonder." Yet Shelley renders the tragic consequences of those moments at which our technological advances exceed the ethical framework we possess in which to apply them. Also those moments when we push the very definition of humanity itself. In his 2019 article on technology innovation and AI ethics, published in the Research Library issues, today's speaker asks questions that would have resonated with Mary Shelley when he observes that technology innovation is broaching fundamental questions about humanity and ethics. Shelley would agree with Johnson's keen observation that information is the central concern. The information that these new technological innovations are rendering is the central concern of libraries, library sciences, and the educational domain more generally. As Dr. Johnson astutely observes, quote, "Libraries are uniquely positioned to leverage innovation for enhancing the delivery of information to broad populations of learners." This wonderful assertion takes me right back to Mary Shelley. As you might remember, Frankenstein and his creature, both autodidacts, have access to libraries that shape their worldview and their ethical systems. Indeed, it is a library that shapes their very humanity. Johnson, like Mary Shelley, eloquently asserts the need for technology to serve human interest and writes that colleges and universities will need to invest greater research sources in humanistic programs of study for their diversity of thought, for the expertise they provide on the human condition in all its forms, and for the enabling of transdisciplinary communities. That approach, which an institution the caliber of VCU is uniquely posed to realize, will ensure that the humanities and the sciences help create the future to lead to innovation and structure, responsible governance for a technological society. Let me turn it back over to Christina to introduce our speaker.
Thank you so much, Catherine, and for your kind words and for your leadership of the college this past year. Before I introduce our speaker, let me say a few words for those of you on Zoom. As your questions emerge, please post them and we'll field them at the end. And for those of you here, we'd like you to join us for a reception after this talk. Before I introduce our speaker, let me say a few words of thanks to Lydia Klinger, one of the souls of this event, also to Lisa Balance, Mangala Subramaniam, Jamie Stillman, and Rani Sisavath, and really everyone who helped make this event and the entire slate of research weeks here possible. As Shriram Rao, who will be here very soon, he's running here from a meeting. As he put it in his opening remarks on Monday, this week's talks, including today's, provide insight into the future, recognizing opportunities in the present and challenging us to learn from the past, all through the lens of innovation. And how wonderful it is to have Sylvester here. It is my honor to introduce him and to welcome him back to VCU. He was here about a year ago when we met. He's an internationally recognized humanities scholar working across several areas of research, including technology, race, religion, and national security. He's the author and editor of 4 books. I will read the titles, may I? The Myth of Ham in 19th Century American Christianity, Race, Heathens, and the People of God, which received the 2005 American Academy of Religion Best First Book Award, and then African American Religions, 1500 to 2000. Colonialism, Democracy and Freedom, published by Cambridge in 2015, and with Stephen Weitzman, The FBI and Religion, Faith and National Security Before and After 9/11, published by University of California Press in 2017. With Tessa Wenger, he edited the volume Religion and the U.S. Empire, Critical New Histories, just published last year by NYU Press. He's now at work on a new book on human identity in the age of intelligent machines and human-machine symbiosis. And he's also producing a digital scholarly edition of an early English history of global religions. Dr. Johnson is also the recipient of numerous fellowships and grants. I will not list them, both at Virginia Tech and at his 2 previous institutions, Indiana University and Northwestern University. His award-winning scholarship advances new approaches to understanding the human condition and also social institutions of power in an age of intelligent machines and other forms of technology innovation. Besides being a mesmerizing speaker, as you will see very soon, a great scholar and a fellow evangelizer for the humanities. This, by the way, is the best compliment I've received in my 2.5 years in this position. Sylvester serves in several key administrative positions at Tech. He is the founding director, as you can see there, of the Virginia Tech Center for Humanities, and he has recently been named Associate Vice Provost for Public Interest Technology. He's also the executive director of the university's Tech for Humanity initiative. This initiative foregrounds the role of ethics, empathy, policy, responsible innovation, equity, human factor design, human identity, creativity, global collaboration, societal values, inclusion and diversity, sustainability, and attention toward the future of work to ensure a viable outlook for human thriving for human thriving amid significant innovations in technology. That was a mouthful. This is the description from your website. I met Sylvester at VCU about a year ago, as I mentioned, when he gave the Black Lake lecture in the Department of History. His talk then was called "Will Robots Feel Pain? The History of Religion, the Politics of Race, and the Digital Future of Humanity." He has been a wonderful interlocutor over the last year, and I look forward to continuing the discussions emerging from this lecture today as we plan for the 2024-25 year at the HRC, when our research focus will be technology humanities. Professor Johnson's talk today is about the vital role of the humanities in shaping the future of technology and innovation. Without further ado, please help me in welcoming Professor Johnson back to VCU.
Thank you, Christine. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for the very kind, generous invitation to be here, and I'm really grateful for generosity, and the more I get to live, the more appreciative I am for that. Just the spirit of kindness. As you mentioned, Christina was here a year ago, and have enjoyed our conversations. We were in that global consortium for humanities centers and institutes, and we got to have some interaction there as well. To the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, thank you, very kind, as to engage with some of the writing I've done and connecting to these issues. Looking forward to conversations about your own leadership of some of these initiatives that have connected the disciplinary work that happens in our institutions to the possible career pathways, and just a broad sense of understanding the increasingly vital role that the comprehensive mission of education plays. And to your provost and the provost team who are here, it speaks volumes that you're co-sponsoring this event. It is very inspiring that amidst I don't know if there's a secret fund that hires people to write an article every 3 months about the death of humanity. Someone must be underwriting this writing. Every 2 or 3 months, something else comes out. And someone pointed out at a meeting I was at 2 weeks ago that the humanities has had a funeral for every 2 or 3 months for about 50 years now. So I don't know if there's life after death, are we zombies, or something wrong with that narrative. But we're still here, and really, I am just personally excited, grateful to be invited back, and to see so many of you here. And David Lally is a colleague formerly at Virginia Tech. It's great to see you here, a great friend as well. So thank you. I am eager to have some conversations during and after this talk. I know there's a dinner arranged that is engaging with some of the high-level issues that are part of some of the fun and challenging and not so fun and sometimes disturbing problems and opportunities that we as a global society have to contend with. And so I want to talk today about humanities and public interest technology. This subtitle, Leading the Ethical Governance of Innovation. I'll explain this further in the talk, but public interest technology is simply the different types of activities that are happening across our society. I'll talk about it within the context of academic institutions, but it's beyond academic, that are aiming to generate the future applications, creation, design of technology in ways that get us benefit for the public. We've gotten very good at getting innovation and technology to work for the growth of private capital, but what about public interest? How do we attend to that? How do we be accountable for it? How do we invest more richly in our ability to foreground the well-being of the public, of the people, so to speak? And so I want to talk about that in relationship to humanities, and my slide deck is basically trying to tell or retell a story that begins with the 1960s origin of the National Endowment for Humanities and National Endowment for the Arts. And I'll try to frame that in the kind of way by spinning a narrative. You can tell me whether you think it's true or not, in relationship to Sputnik and the things that happened after that, talking about the investment in science, math, and engineering and technology. And then ending with some of the ways that those investments have paid tremendous dividends, but also have demonstrated both our capacity to invest and our failure to be comprehensive with that investment, and how that creates an opportunity space for us now to really anchor into what should be a comprehensive mission for our academic institutions, for which humanities has to play not just a vital role, but actually a transformative role in engendering new ecosystems, new architectures for the kind of work that we will need to see in the future talent that's going to resolve some of these challenges and ensure that if we have a future, that it'll be one that we actually want to inhabit. Okay? And then we'll welcome your thoughts about this as well as we move forward. So thank you again. And as I said, I wanted to start with a retelling of a story about the origins, not of humanities. Humanities, depending on how you define it, has been around since, I don't know, smiling, black pepper, exercise, however long. But that the National Endowment for the Humanities, National Endowment for the Arts, were created by federal legislation, the National Foundation on the Arts and the Humanities Act of 1965, under whose administration, under Lyndon Baines Johnson's administration, he's pictured here, this photo, that was marking the signing of that act. And what I want to frame is that the nation's leaders and very important humanities councils and academic organizations and experts had perceived for years that the technological advancements that were happening in the application of those technologies, particularly within the context of a Cold War and through the application of things like the atomic bomb, which the US used against civilians in Japan, and the growth of nuclear weapons and the race to space, we'll get to that in a moment. All of those things were raising very important opportunities, but also deeply unsettling questions about the very future of our world, of our society. And that consternation and that concern is captured particularly poignantly in this quote by Glenn Seaborg, who led the Atomic Energy Commission and was thinking very deeply and deliberately about the use of nuclear weapons, as well as what's here, because atomic energy, you think energy for civilian purposes, which was part of that, but a lot of this was devoted to defense protocols and defense and weaponization capacities. And what he wrote within the context of the creation of the National Endowment for Humanities and the National Endowment of the Arts was that we cannot afford to drift physically, morally, or aesthetically in a world in which the current moves so rapidly towards an abyss. Science and technology are providing us with the means to travel swiftly. But what course do we take? This is the question that no computer can answer. He could have written this last week, right? ChatGPT. I mean, this is still very current. And what it samples is a larger set of concerns and discourses and practices that were responding to something, to a long moment of recognizing that there needed to be a type of comprehensive investment in knowledge and capacities, in the research, in the way that our institutions were being developed and structured. And so this was 1965. And so this is several years after the US had decided to focus on something else. And the takeaway here, my point is that it's actually the response to understanding the deep investment in and growth of technology capacities, especially within the context of the Cold War, especially with the deep understanding that we have for decades now as humans have funded and developed unique capacities to completely destroy all of humanity. Like we've been doing that, and we're about to redo it, by the way, those of you who've been following the reset or refresh of the nuclear arsenal. No, that's a $1 trillion plus undertaking that's supposed to last about 60 years. So all the US nuclear weapons and installations are being refreshed, redone now, in hopes that we'll never use the products of that $1 trillion expenditure. I'm not saying that cynically, I'm saying that as a way of just marking the continuation of this history. So it's in that context that actually as a recognition there needs to be investment in humanities. And this is how the institutions federal institutions that actually fund arts and humanities, this is how they form. This is how they get created. They get created as a way of trying to respond to what Seaborg was articulating. And so one way is to think about how this might disrupt a more familiar narrative that STEM is somehow creating this shadow and threat to humanities. What this story tells us is that actually there were very important anchors and funding mechanisms of humanities that got created precisely because of the thoughtfulness that was happening in light of the advancements of technology. But even before 1969, even before 1965 when that got passed, of course, 1957 was very important, the year that what was in the Soviet Union successfully launched a satellite into space, Sputnik. This is not a picture of that satellite. This is just any satellite. It makes the point that we're actually moving into the ability to leave the Earth's atmosphere, to go into space and to control that space, what was often called a race for space, had one of the most significant impacts on not just federal funding, but all kinds of investment activity globally. And as I have indicated here with this slide header, a lot of that is framed as a competition and a race. It was. That's not gone away either. So all of us know about the CHIPS Act, and we know about the effort to fund the research, the R&I that's supposed to help ensure that the United States does not fall behind in AI technologies and related digital tech innovation, but also is able to maintain its status as a world leader. And that is, beneath that surface, of course, there's a lot of concerns about military preparedness. And so it's an early iteration that goes away. But Sputnik was definitely a wake-up call. It was treated by the United States as a very, very clear indication that there needed to be an ambitious way of naming targets, of deliverables, of accomplishments that might emerge from some of the practical applications of the advancements happening in science and engineering. And so what that resulted in, of course, as we all know, very familiar with this, was $30 billion of investment by the US government just to get to this point, landing a human on the moon. Of course, the first person who did that moonwalk in the US was Neil Armstrong, 1969. So that was 12 years later. That was 12 years. Incidentally, I'm not trying to promote Virginia Tech, but incidentally, I would never do that, but incidentally, this is actually the same year that Virginia Tech decided to become a comprehensive university because it had been technical. And I've said this before, I would love to have been a fly on the wall in that boardroom conversation about why, when all this federal funding for STEM is flowing from the government, why if you led a university, you decide, and you were STEM, why would you become comprehensive? Why not just optimize your capacity to get those revenues? And of course, it was actually because the 1965 thing. It was but we can't just do only that. There are some very high-level questions about how we're going to manage our society as a world that is shaped by important advancements that exceed our capacity to actually handle it. But that comprehensiveness was very important. But 1969, the US, of course, succeeds in this effort, but that was only the beginning because it was never about only landing a person on the moon. It was about creating a new future of talent that would move so far beyond what had happened in the past, that you would have boundless capacity to venture into new directions, to create new abilities and applications from everything from drug therapies to digital tech to transportation, et cetera. And so one of the things that happened in the 80s and 90s, of course, was the growth of computing as an area that was not just for experts. Computers stopped being people because the first computers were humans who computed the formulas that were required to put a person into space and land someone on the moon. And Virginia, the state of Virginia, of course, had a lot to do with that. It's a very important film, has memorialized. But also that there were other applications that would go out to consumers to deliver things that people had barely, if ever, imagined before. And Silicon Valley emerged as the center of this revolution, of this innovation, so that today, California, this is a state, is the world's 5th largest economy. I mean, think about that. That's compared to other nations. And it's because of those huge highly valued companies, Apple, for example, and Google, and Meta, and many others that have thrived in one particular region of California and have driven not only economic growth, but they've changed so many different aspects of our lives. This is why those of you who are joining us remotely can do it. And it's why many of us, remember when people said, I'll never teach online. Do you remember that? Everyone taught online, of course. The only thing we didn't do online successfully was to sing happy birthday. I don't think anyone has ever figured out how to make that work because of the lag that you get. But Silicon Valley was actually a very visceral physical manifestation of the kind of investment that was happening globally. This was not just the United States, of course. The nations around the world were understanding the emergence of something that people were beginning to call the digital tech world, or the world of computing. And computing moved from being something that a few experts did, or something that was a hobby if you were really good at math and coding. It became something that today is part of how we live our lives. I got here because I just stuck my phone and plugged it into the car and followed the GPS thing that was built into the smartphone. And here, of course, is someone wearing a virtual reality headset that has become part of some of the gaming technologies and also more broadly virtual experiences of the world. Those capacities, those investments all were repeatedly demonstrating the power of the foresight that went into structuring not only federal dollars to support science, technology, engineering, and math, but also to ensure that a larger ecosystem of private companies were thriving, that there were new markets emerging for this growth. The emergence of generative AI today has, I think, been especially important for giving us a sense of some other things that are going to happen in the coming years on a greater scale that go far beyond AI. But it gives a preview of the type of societal challenges raised by innovation. I'm saying preview, it's a post view, right? And it's a present view. But there are also some things that are going to continue to unfold in the next few years that I think this is sort of not a rehearsal for, but a preview for. So generative AI, of course, is AI that can be trained on data to be ingested that may be textual, it could be visual data, it could be audio data. And after being fed so many examples of a particular type of entity in a data set, could be people or the sound of a human voice or something else, or art, it can then generate new phenomena, new examples of that genre, whether it's textual or visual, that it's never seen before, that it's never ingested before, based on the way it's been trained on that data. And that's why it's called generative. It's generating something that it's never been shown or never been fed or never been trained on. That is the same type of thing. And ChatGPT is one example of this, but DALL-E is another that OpenAI created that does, all right, you can prompt it to create some image and it will. And of course, the audio version of this, any of our voices today can be replicated through AI. And there are lots of concerns about the pitfalls of that or the misuses of that. But the point is that perhaps, certainly more than most areas of innovation, generative AI has demonstrated a very significant weakness in our lack of comprehensiveness in investing in the kind of talent that we need to ensure that as a human society, that we have a world that's viable, that's fair, that is humane, and that gives us the kinds of experiences and opportunities that we need to have as full human beings. So I said before that what we have done exceptionally well is to get innovation to work for the growth of private capital, which is important. Okay? But there are things that are even more important than the growth of private capital, and that is the interest of the public. That's actually the lives of people, and they don't need to be pitted against each other. We're actually going to need more capital if we want to deal with the future of human need, because there's this growing inequality. And they're concerned about how people will have what they need, especially if you've read The 100-Year Life and that kind of thing. People are supposed to live longer, but what are you going to do if you retire at 60 and live to be 110? How are you going to pay for that? But the point is that the public interest requires lots of skills that are humanistic, that are human-centered, that are rooted in disparities and the expertise that's needed in order to architect, to design the kind of solutions that we'll need to have. Something else beyond AI, I said that the so-called generative AI and so-called AI revolution has given a preview of some things. So biotech and precision medicine are enabling a different future for humanity that I call human engineering. Most people don't call it that. If you go to a biotech company, they say they're doing genetic engineering, or they may say precision medicine if you're talking to the NIH. But what I think is going to happen is that in the coming years, that biotech companies will full on design people at the genetic and cellular level as a mass service. Not that everyone will be able to afford to get it if we don't structure it that way, but that it will not simply be, oh, you have this disease, we're going to engineer your DNA so your body can actually free itself of this diabetic condition and produce its own insulin, which we can do right now. That's very, very cutting edge, but we can do it. But we're actually going to just go full scale and say, Sylvester Johnson, we have this genetic analysis of your DNA, and we're going to take your DNA and your partner's DNA for reproductive purpose. We're just going to redesign that, and we're going to correct for those dispositions or abnormalities that would predispose your hypothetical offspring to develop all kinds of things. So I have an aggressive form of prostate. I don't have prostate cancer. There is an aggressive strain of prostate cancer that runs in my family. I don't have it. I was misspeaking. And it runs very strongly in my family. And so every year I go and make sure I try to catch this thing. Would I be interested in my posterity never having to worry about that because it's been something in my family for generations? I'd be interested in that. Lots of people would be interested in that kind of thing. Aggressive forms of breast cancer run through particular families. It's genetically specific. Would thoughtful people not be interested in having their descendants not have to worry about developing breast cancer? Of course they would be interested in that. They would want to find out about it. Even if they decided that they weren't going to do it, they'd want to find out about it for basic human reasons. So I put it that way because in 2018, He Jiankui, scientists in China who had trained at Rice University, announced that he had genetically modified twin embryos in order to make the children that will result immune to HIV. And what he did was to alter a gene that's implicated in the ability of the HIV virus to actually penetrate a cell. And you alter that gene, it becomes almost impossible for the HIV virus to penetrate that cell. Any cell in that human that has that genetic distinction. Because today there are people who are immune to HIV. There are not many of them, but they are, and it's because they have this genetic mutation that means the HIV cannot actually penetrate their cells. You're not supposed to mess with what are called germ cells, or cells that are going to produce heritable characteristics, and this would be heritable. Like those twins, they've been born now, by the way, that was years ago. In theory, their descendants could be immune from HIV. We don't know that, but in theory. But he went to prison because it's actually illegal to do that. You're not supposed to create genetic modifications that can be inherited, that are heritable. And he was roundly condemned around the world, okay? And he violated Chinese law, and he was fined something like close to $500,000. And he just got out of prison a few months ago. He's already started another lab. He's working on muscular dystrophy. This is what he wants to eradicate. And he's being much more careful this time. He said that he moved too quickly, but he is seeking to eradicate this through gene therapy. And my point is that I think we would be distracted if we focused only on the infraction, that he violated ethical standards, and we don't recognize that every year that goes by, billions of dollars are being invested to improve our ability to do this right here, to genetically modify people, not only to cure disease, but to have the capacity to actually design the kind of people in the future who will be more robust, who will have a different type of biochemistry that is optimized for certain kind of outcomes. And this is why I say that what we're seeing, the uproar over generative AI, that's sort of funny, because you remember when we went away for December break and the world was one way and then ChatGPT came out? And I wonder if they timed it that way, because they knew all the academics would be on break and they gave us 2 weeks to figure out our game plan. And over that 2 or 3 week period, K-12 and colleges, university, we had to figure out, well, are we going to assign papers to our students? So we had about 3 weeks, because had they done that mid-semester, it would have been even harder. But I wonder, did they do it just to give us 2 or 3 weeks? But it felt like the world shifted. And we came back in January, and people had to assign writing again. And all of the policy people at our colleges and universities, you know who they are, because you've been talking to, trying to figure out, are we going to ban it? Are we going to keep our students from getting on openai.com on the Wi-Fi? Or are we going to allow them to access this thing? But what we've realized is that we don't have regulation over this. We don't even have the protocols in place to create regulatory effects. Because this is very complicated. It's everything from data sets to who gets to design things. OpenAI has a very interesting financial model where I don't get into the weeds with it, but what they've suggested is if they get to a certain point in profitability, that the company will take only so much profit for itself, and then that might go somewhere else in society, even though that hasn't gotten figured out. But this is just a little taste of what's to come, because we're talking about a texting software, a chat bot. That's what we're talking about. And I'm not saying that to trivialize it. It's actually very important. I'm saying that this is coming. Okay, this is already here. And if we think that what happened with He-Jian Kui, or he broke the law, he shouldn't do that again. If you think this is going away, then I'll repeat what I said earlier, that most thoughtful human beings, not everyone, but most thoughtful human beings would love for their children not to have to suffer from the fatal illnesses and diseases that they might be predisposed to suffer from. And for that very humane reason, and because billions of dollars are being invested in our capacity to do this each year, what we will see in the years to come is a high-level rollout of what I'm calling human engineering. You can call it genetic engineering or precision medicine. But it will, among other things, give us the ability to design people. And I think that biotech companies are going to hire for this kind of talent. And I think that the departments that we have in our universities are going to have to do a shuffle. And we're doing it around AI right now. But I think if you look at metrics like the valuation of companies and the implications for curricula, and the challenges and opportunities as well for policy, okay? All of those things are going to have to be retooled by the time this arrives at scale, if we're going to have a world that we want to live in, because this could easily go in all kinds of directions that might not be in anyone's interest. In other words, what we need is a new ecosystem of governance. So not government, okay? Government will have to be part of this. But governance, it's managing our technology, controlling it. And not in a cynical kind of way that is this awful thing and we've got to put tech in a cage because it's dangerous. Technology, I was talking to Pramesh Lalu's a very celebrated humanities scholar from the University of Western Cape in South Africa. So he was visiting with us a couple of weeks ago at Virginia Tech. And we were talking about some of these issues. And he said something that I said I wanted to repeat it, but I would cite him. That's why I just told you that there has never been a moment in the history of humankind when we have been out of relationship with technology. In the entire history of our evolution, it's just never been the case. And if you look at all the things that our gut bacteria do, or the way that we manipulate the world in order to change ourselves or our environment, so I'm taking that broad humanistic understanding of what tech is. It's not something that just started in the 1960s. But we have been changing ourselves and the world through techne throughout our history as humans. And I don't think we should stop doing that. I think what we do have to start doing, however, is creating something new. And this is sort of what was being hinted at in that quote that I opened with, that there are certain answers that we have to have as a society that our technology is not going to give us. And it's not going to come, I will go further, it's not going to come from narrowly focusing on only technical forms of knowledge. We need technical forms of knowledge because it's not going to exclude that either. It requires all hands on board. It's going to require comprehensiveness. And it's not going to be just an academic thing. This new ecosystem is already emerging. So you've seen some examples of things like the research labs on AI that have started. They're not commercial companies per se. They're trying to study the effects of AI and trying to theorize the practices that need to be put in place in order to give us the results we need. One of these is the Distributed AI Research Institute that Timnit Gebru has created. Another is the Algorithmic Justice League. And Timnit Gebru has emphasized, for example, that large language models, so that's what ChatGPT is an example of, will continue to have problems, and that what you need is a different kind of paradigm shift that's rooted in a very different approach to the data sets that are training those. But the point is that this is one edge of this new ecosystem. There are lots of other things that need to happen as part of this ecosystem. Another of those things is the kinds of training, of education, of the future talent. Humanities is going to get structured into key problem spaces and collaborative efforts to create this future of talent that we're going to need. And it's going to happen for many different reasons, partly because of the fabulous work, Christina, that you're doing in evangelizing and in messaging and helping people to understand humanities. Part of it because of what VCU is doing, where you have this coordination between humanities and the Office of the Provost, and you have a visionary dean who understands that these different pathways to learning have to fulfill a comprehensive mission. And then some of it's going to happen for different kinds of reasons, because we have movements of civic organizers and activists who may or may not be in the streets, but they are pulling away or they're getting kicked out of existing companies that are refocusing how they're going to invest in talent. So in the 2010s, so 2015, 16, 17, 18, we saw lots of companies in tech that were creating and building ethics teams and ethics talent inside of those companies. And many of them that have been in the headlines, I'm not going to call any names, still have some of that talent in their companies, even while they have offloaded some of that talent. But the shift is happening where there's a process whereby the talent that is focused on governing from within the governance of tech from within those companies is setting up new shops and new homes, because something bigger is happening in our society. You almost can't go a week reading headlines without reading about the fights that we're having as a society globally over tech. And the things that we're fighting about are not about technical standards or technical capacities per se. They're about that human edge of technology. It's questions like, how are we going to continue to have democratic institutions and democratic processes in light of the trends happening with the future of work? What about the future of wealth and inequality? Had you said to anyone in the 1980s, in 25, 30 years, they're going to be trillion-dollar-plus companies, they would have laughed you away. This is like, that's absurd. You can't have a trillion-dollar company. The company would never be valued that high. And we saw that. Apple was the first one in 2018. And a year later, there was another one. And eventually, there were a dozen or half dozen. And don't be distracted by the fact that we've seen a drastic reduction in those market values over the past 12 months because of the stock market's decline. The point is that this is only the beginning of tremendous value creation that is happening when, for example, even sovereign states become, like the United States government, becomes a tenant in the ecosystem of data and digital services, where the landlords are private companies, because the CIA has to subscribe to AWS just like you do. Yeah, think about it. You have the same landlord. in that digital ecosystem. And in that world where even sovereign states are tenants, in that world where valuation exceeds anything that most people would have imagined, in that world, and we get to this next part, where sure, you know, your kids might become one of the designers, not in a studio that's not for art per se, but for humans, for future humans, who are not gonna be like us by design. That in that world, we have to have a different kind of talent that is informed by, but not controlled by, the disciplinary packaging and divides that we have right now. So I'll give you an example of one of the ways that another way that this ecosystem is emerging. So I've just talked to you about those research labs that are trying to figure out new paradigms, new practices and protocols. So the EU is experimenting with something called a data trust initiative. And this is one example of a structure that is part of this emerging public interest technology ecosystem. So data trust, we've heard people say, well, people should own their data. It's not fair that companies collect all of this data just because I walk from my car here, and I don't know how many data brokers now have that information about me, but they have it and they can repackage it and they can monetize it, and they do it. And if you ask me, Sylvester, should you have ownership of your data? I said, well, it's a data set. I understand you can't own data, but you own the data set. Say, well, I don't know, perhaps. Well, Sylvester, how would you actually monetize your data? Because I basically have to quit my day job and go figure out how to do that. It's actually pretty involved. You don't just, I have my data in a jar, it's here in this bottle, and now I can monetize my data. No, it's actually a very complicated business model. And so the European Union has realized that. And in bringing together the need to attend to the future of prosperity and the wealth divide, with the understanding that there needs to be regulation of the privacy standards with data, and that there needs to be some kind of way of getting the public to both participate in and benefit from not just data services, but from the value creation, from the capital growth that we've seen from data. What they've done is to say, it is unrealistic, even if we were to say, okay, you now own your data sets, which would be a complicated thing to do, because the data sets have to get created as sets, as a data set, as a set of data, not just a random act, but you package them together. You now own it. So that's not going to give you monetary benefit. So what they've said is, what you need is some steward of your data who will do all of that complicated work on your behalf. They're going to figure out the legal agreements between private companies and public people, the citizens or the public. They're going to figure out the business models and the revenue sharing that needs to go on so that people can participate in the monetization of their data. And as we walk into this future where this data becomes more valuable, instead of the public becoming angrier, that inflation is robbing them of their buying power, and a few private companies are enjoying unprecedented value growth, that they'll actually get to participate in the monetary benefit. They're creating this data every time they walk or shop or breathe. Why not have more power as a consumer to live your life as a result of that? And so the data trusts are basically the EU saying the government's going to be a steward. We're going to set up a trust for your data. We're going to create the business model and revenue sharing around it. We're going to work with these private companies. They're still going to monetize your data, and you're going to get to participate in the monetization or the benefit of the monetization, because some of that will go to you as part of the public. Some of it will go to the companies, and this government entity as a steward is going to do the work, so you don't have to quit your day job to figure out how to monetize your data. You can just enjoy the benefit, and we can get some shared prosperity, okay? So that's one example of technology in the public interest, where you're actually working on a problem that's actually very hard. You don't have to agree with that example, but it is an example that's emerging that tries to make the point that what we need is new ideas, new capacities, and new creations, and a new ecosystem of talent that can actually create something different from what we have right now, so that our innovation is not just seen as this big threat for well-being, but it's actually benefiting the public. There are global dimensions of justice and equitable outcomes that will enable us to govern technology. Those structures, the mechanisms that we need, will not be achieved through technocratic practices, but rather through democratic protocols and institutions. And I don't mean only formal democracies, because anyone who's familiar with the histories of democracies know that democracies can decide whom they're going to treat as the people and whom they aren't going to treat as the people. We know that democracies can be formal democracies and still be unjust. But those democratic practices and processes have to be done in a way that we actually get shared prosperity, that we actually get good outcomes that work for most people, that we actually have talent that was educated and trained in a way to get this to happen. One implication of this, I was looking at an article about the African Leadership University, which is a university that is mostly non-residential, that started in 2013 and operates in multiple nations throughout Africa. And the students, instead of choosing a major, they choose a mission. Yeah, they choose a mission instead of a major. And their mission might be food security, or it might be shared prosperity. It might be something else. But they choose a mission. And that's the basis of how they create courses or take classes and go through their curriculum. And then they move on seeking some opportunity to act on that mission. Now, please don't go back and tell anyone that Sylvester said that we should do away with majors and departments, because I never said that. But what I am saying is that we can be inspired by some of these examples as we begin to imagine how we're going to get to democratic processes to govern, to actually manage our technology. And so, I'll end here, as we understand the opportunity space in front of us as a global society, that we have to have deliberate mechanisms for cultivating future talent that is globally minded. Okay? There are lots of nationalist enterprises that are informing and shaping the way our technology systems work, and that's important. And at the same time, we have to recognize that tech innovation is like climate. You can't do it country by country only. Your nation state needs to have policies and agenda and goals and those things, and needs to be engaged with the rest of the world that all share the same climate. Our tech companies, the biggest ones, the most powerful ones, are multinational. That means they're actually, capital has never been nationalist. In fact, one of the things, this may sound odd and strange to you, because it sounds odd and strange to me, and I'm saying it, acknowledge that, but one of the things that corporations and universities and colleges have in common is that we've never been rooted in nationalism. We've always been operating on the global transnational. Even amidst all of our injustices and exclusions, it's always transnational. The intellectual formations and influences, everything from the Mediterranean schools of thought to however you want to map it. We wouldn't have a faculty if it wasn't for the world. We wouldn't have students if it weren't for the world. Corporations wouldn't have talent if it weren't for the world. And even the things that we may call American technology, US technology, go inside these companies that are creating that top technology and see who the humans are in those companies. It's the world, okay? But we have to have a global approach that is engaged, that is visionary, and that is creative. And so where do humanities, social justice, and technology meet? One of the most important ways that they're coming together is this new ecosystem of public interest technology. And it's the organizations, the institutions, the practices, the curricula that are emerging now, that are forming in a deliberate way to structure the talent that we're gonna need to govern that future that we're gonna create. That future is coming. No one knows exactly what it's gonna look like. And it's possible that an asteroid would hit the Earth and all of this research and investment in innovation will come to a halt. But as a practical matter, I think that rather than betting on the asteroid, we should bet on being ready for this future. And if it doesn't happen, at least we're ready. But in the meantime, let's prepare the future talent that's comprehensive, let's collaborate and learn from one another's institutions. So I'm delighted to be invited here. We should follow up in what ways, how are we gonna work together to govern this future? Because this is gonna be all hands on deck. The problems that we're seeing are opportunities that they can either eat us alive as problems or they can inspire us to work together. And just as we saw in the 1960s, at the height of the Cold War, just years before the first landing on the moon, when the US, in the midst of an unprecedented investment in science, math, engineering, what's going on, said, you know what, we've got to institutionalize the support for humanities and the arts. And the rationale was actually very clear at that time, right? And I think what we have to do in the 21st century, in 2023 and beyond, is to recognize that there is a very important lesson to be grasped from that history. And the lesson is that the challenges that we're seeing with technology are inspiring us, or should inspire us, in order to take to the next level our ability to execute a comprehensive mission. And that technology has never been just technical stuff. It actually requires this human frontier of expertise, and that we can prepare ourselves in a deliberate way to create that future talent that will actually solve these challenges that are emerging with the opportunities that our innovation is bringing us. So thank you very much. I would love to hear your comments and answer your questions.
Thank you, Sylvester. Can you hear me okay? I'm going to pass the mic around, and please introduce yourself and before you ask your question. Questions?
Or comments. I mean, you don't have to ask questions. You have thoughts about this, because, yes. Go ahead.
You need the mic because we have some people.
Oh, for the remote listeners, or if you want to ask it from there, I'll repeat it for the sake of our remote listeners.
Okay.
I'll save you some steps.
Okay.
All right. So as I was listening to your talk, and thank you so much for giving this talk, I was thinking about how we govern the internet, right? And how the different governance structures that sprung up in the 70s and 80s and 90s still continue on to this day to some degree to, think about the protocols that people use across the world to, communicate with each other. Is that model sort of similar to what you're thinking? Do you have issues with that model? I'm curious.
Thank you. I'm going to repeat that. And just to make sure I heard you, did you say the governance of the internet? That's right. Is the model? Thank you. So the question was that there is a model in the governance of the internet that we've seen since the 70s and 80s that regulates the way people use the internet and how that works globally. And there are lots of, I'm trying to ad-lib your question. And so is that a model that approximates what I'm talking about? Is that, did I get it right? So thank you very much for that question. So it's a very great idea to point to that because there is a history of tech regulation, and that, of course, the Telecommunications Act of the 1990s was that big change that allowed the public to access the internet, because at first it was only for government employees or contractors or people in some kind of relationship with the government. And once it became open, that led to a massive influx of change and development in software. America Online, if you're old enough to remember AOL, you start up a computer and it asks, you say you've got mail. It's like Pavlov's dog, you're waiting to hear that message. With something. So there was something very important about that. I'm glad you raised it as an example, because there was enough consensus at the federal level to create the policy around the internet that got us those shifts and changes, and other kind of industry standards organizations that allowed for technical protocols to exist, so that I have one brand computer, you have another, and we can both use the same internet. Right? That actually had to get worked out. And so is that approximating what I'm talking about? At some level it is. because that involved coordination both within policy networks within a given state, nation state, and also global. It reflected the hegemony of the United States because we don't have .us at the end of our URLs, and other nations, they have something to mark their nation. We're just supposed to be generic. So that, that difference is there. But the point is that you have both of these things going on. And so that, I think, is a very powerful example. What's missing is that is largely government, not only state organizations. I just told you they're non-governmental entities that are part of it. What we need for this future of government tech is actually needs to go far beyond that, okay? So I will say repeatedly, first, we've been telling as a society the wrong story about technology by treating it as STEM only. And then say, well, we got this technical stuff, and so we'll sprinkle on some non-technical people to solve the technology stuff. And that story is very familiar to all of us, whether or not we claim it. We at least know the story. And I think we've been telling the wrong story. I think we have to recognize that technology is not only technical, it's also these other things. It's also comprehensive. It's also humanistic. It's also other elements. I mean, just in terms of what it is at its core. And when we understand that, I think that we'll have to do some things very differently. So instead of centering our focus on technical skills and looking to technical experts to say, okay, we're going to bring you into the room and we're going to get these standards together, which was not entirely, but largely what happened with the development of the internet and the standards around it. We need a much more comprehensive field of talent that says, you're an expert in X, and X might be inequality, or it might be creativity, or it might be something else entirely. Carceral systems and the way they actually impact people. We're going to need leadership from humanistic disciplines and fields of expertise to participate in actually shaping and creating the institutions that are doing this governance. We're going to need different kinds of ecosystems. I'll give you an example. What I mean by ecosystems, I just told you that we're seeing the beginning of a new ecosystem crop up. So there are people they've been kicked out or they voluntarily left companies that were structured formerly as technology companies, and they created their own outfits as research labs, which is going to be essential to this. And their aim is not to grow capital. Their aim is to create new protocols and to innovate processes for technical systems. And those processes are not technical, those processes are humanistic, okay? But there needs to be something else, so they exist as they don't have a commercial business model. And examples, NYU's AI Now Lab, Algorithmic Justice League, and the DARE Institute, okay, are some examples I'm pointing to. Then you have these large companies or small companies, and they're still mostly hiring people whose expertise is technical. And they see their product primarily as a technical service primarily, okay? So even if these research labs come up with if they innovate a process, and one of them, just to cite Tim McGrew, is to curate data sets. That's very expensive, by the way. You can't just scrape stuff from the internet for free. You've got to pay someone to make up a data set, okay? Either pull together records, and they can't be just 100 records. You need millions, hundreds of thousands of these records, or even sometimes millions. But you curate it. And if you could have a curated data set that did not reflect our history, because as our society, we don't treat everybody equally, we don't. And then we want to act surprised when the AI that we trained with our history looks like what we do to one another, right? Well, it's calling people names or is ignoring these people, but we do that, and so it's reflect. So you need a curated data set that looks different. And so that would actually have to be seen as a governance exercise, as a governance exercise. And you should have federal funding not only for weapons development, not only for technical systems, but also for process innovation. Like you'd want either the NSF or maybe a different kind of 1965 moment where we take our inspiration from that quote, Glenn Seaborg, and say, yeah, we need a national endowment for public interest. And it's going to be led. It's not going to exclude anybody because we're comprehensive. We have to be comprehensive. But we're not going to treat the humanists as the people we call the week before the grants do and say, hey, Sylvester, can we add you on? I know people are laughing. That happens. You know, they're actually going to lead the thing. And we also do it so that's what we've done for the internet's inspiring, but we actually have to go far beyond that to imagine how you could connect research labs to some other kind of entity, like the public benefit company is an example. So it's 13, 15 years old as an entity that has a public benefit in its charter. Okay, it's part of your mission. So that means you cannot be sued by your shareholders if you decide you're going to be less profitable because you want to support public interest. Okay. So that type of structure exists. You can now do that in the US. And you still operate for profit, but it's got to be in balance with your public. And we have to train talent to say, look, we're going to judge success of humanities degrees, not just by what your salary is. We should start recognizing people, giving them awards, give them a chair for their humanistic impact on the world through tech, not just how much money they earn. And we have to teach people to value that. And that's part of how we're going to. So we've got to go beyond what we've done. We have to connect different kind of businesses and entities to get the research institute's innovation and process to be treated as a valuable asset. Someone needs to be able to benefit in a market system from that innovation. And right now, those research labs, they're not trying to profiteer off that innovation. But they should be able to get some capital from that because they have to keep running. And they have to be paid for their labor. So that's an example of what I'm talking about.
Thank you, Sylvester. This is an amazing presentation. You have me all excited here and energized, and I know many of us are like this. You have made a very powerful and eloquent case about what the future that is coming, right? And the fact that the convergence of biotechnology, information technology, and AI is profoundly not only changing the human experience, but it's changing the essence of being human. What does it mean, right? So all this is coming. And then I think you made a very clear case about the role that humanities needs to play, because it's just not about the technology right now. We need to be able to understand and even predict how this technology will, what does it mean for the human experience, right? There are examples right now. I'll mention one which is quite outdated right now and old-fashioned. Who could have predicted that Facebook, when it was first created, would evolve the way it did, right? And it would be used to even weaponized by political parties and so on. So there is a need not only to create ethical boundaries for technology and so on, but to even begin to do research in understanding how technology will interact with human societies and networks of human beings, right? And the question that I have there is, there is no doubt in my mind that humanities has to be at the center of this. But how does humanities need to change? And how do we prepare our students in a practical way to be able to respond to this need?
Now, this is a great question. So I'll point to a couple of things, one of which I mentioned earlier. I was talking about the mission versus the major. I think we have to create opportunities. And I know we have these institutions in the US that have been around for decades or even more than a century or so. And you can't just say, okay, we're going to have missions instead of majors. But I do think that we can begin to incorporate some of that. And I think that we have to, as a society, I think we have to stop making high school students and their parents feel like in 10th or 12th grade, or even in your freshman year, first year of college, that you're supposed to know what you want to major in. When all of us can read, and we know the research data that how many times are people going to change their careers in the next 20, 30, 50 years. So I think part of it is that we have to tell a different story to students who, even before they get to our universities, that they should think in terms of problem spaces and think in terms of mission. They're passionate about all kinds of things, and we keep telling them as a society, you have to do X, Y, Z. So I mentioned that earlier, though. The second thing, there's a think tank, New America, that administers something called the Public Interest Technology University Network. And it's also part of this new ecosystem that's emerging. It's creating an emerging field. And so there's work to be done on the talent acquisition, workforce hiring side as well. So these are people who are going to, or companies that are going to hire talent. Or maybe it's not a company, maybe it's government, not a private company. Or maybe it's something else, NGO. And so we have to get beyond the point where we are now, where a lot of the companies, this is simplistic but useful, they have a product side and they have a risk management side. And the people who are developing products are the people who create what's going to generate your revenue. And then the people who are in risk management, they're your attorneys or policy people inside your company. And the product comes out before it launches and they tell the people the team that developed it, why they either have to modify it or put it on ice or just kill it altogether, And your company runs by revenue. I mean, you may get some seed capital at first, but eventually you have to generate money or you have to lay off everyone and close shop. You need to be able to generate revenue. We're set up on that dichotomy in the way we educate people. And we make people who, I'm talking about as a society, feel like if they want to do good in the world, that there's not going to be much money in that. But if you don't really care about that, if you optimize for revenue, well, you can be our word is successful, right? That's our word. And which means you can generate a lot of money. So we have to train different. We actually have to create opportunities where our students are working in teams. We have to help students who are in STEM have more opportunities to work side by side by students who are in humanistic disciplines, social sciences, creative disciplines. And they get used to seeing one another year after year. And when they go start these companies, it will make sense to them that they should actually be on the same team. And this product over here and risk over there, that's got to go away. And we have to train people who care about this to do this work over here. You care about impact, you've got to help lead some product development. And we're going to show you how to do that as someone who cares about these humanistic issues. So by creating different kinds of curricular experiences, I'm not saying get rid of majors, I'm saying can we create problem spaces or missions for students to pursue? Can we create ways for them to work together on teams? Can we message differently to the people who are going to do the hiring? So we get beyond the point of everybody's hiring for risk. You figure out how much you're going to get sued if you don't have some people running ethics on your products. And you compare that to your spend for their salaries, and you see how much you predict how much you're going to save, and then you move forward because it's still under this paradigm of managing risk. And what we're not doing is saying we're going to actually sell safety. Volvo did this, they claimed to have the safest car in the world. And it actually worked. Like, they made lots of money doing that. And they actually made a safer car. They didn't just claim it to be doing one thing and not doing it. But we've got to do that with the messaging for the hiring, and we've got to get parents to understand that if your kid majors in whatever, regardless of what they major in, they're going to end up doing multiple jobs over their lifetime. They're going to need multiple skill sets. And we've got to help them to recognize that they don't have to pick the one thing that they're going to do the rest of their lives when they're in 9th, 10th, 11th grade or when they're in college, that they need to get experiences that will help them to be broad. And we've got to but the hiring has to be working too, you see? The market hiring and the messaging has to work. And those aren't all the answers. I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts about this as well. But those are some of the things that we have to do. And then we have to work with these other stakeholders, because these are not problems that the university created. These are problems that our society created. And we're trying to fix it within our universities, but we need to collaborate with these other stakeholders in society to actually address it.
Another question here. And I also wanted to ask you, maybe at some point you can address how tech has started answering these questions. I mentioned Tech for Humanity, which
Yes.
is an initiative you started
Yes.
here. Is there something you can tell us about that initiative and how you are innovating the humanities at Tech?
Absolutely, yeah. So we're doing a separate from some messaging. We're going to have our first Tech for Humanities Summit this June, and we're going to start an annual award that recognizes people who are using technology in a way to, or they're doing something in the technology space to benefit the public interest. We're partnering with New America, which is a think tank that administers that public interest Tech University network. Shannon Raj Singh, who led human rights at Twitter before Twitter got rid of human rights last fall. She was leading human rights. She's an attorney who's worked in an international criminal court for many years and focused on public interest. So she's going to give our keynote. Jennifer Polka, who created Code for America, she's going to be there as well. So we're going to message and recognize and storytell. Let's start to recognize people who are focusing on the public interest. In terms of curriculum, we're creating new course content that is led by humanities faculty at the intersection of technology and social justice that allows students to learn about public interest tech. It teaches them the human side of technology, as well as engaging with the technical side. We've been piloting a program at Virginia Tech that was funded by the Boeing Company for 4 years that did that team teaching where students across 4 years worked on team projects on problems that were shaped by collaborators from private industry as well as the academic instructors in a studio. So it's not just academic faculty in that studio, it's people from private companies there too, or not-for-profit, or from government. One of the projects that came out of that was the students figuring out how do you deliver learning to incarcerated students. Well, there's policy, there's the Department of Corrections. How do you use digital equipment? How do you get digital services into prison? Because prisons are designed to make sure people don't get access to things. How do you give people access to things? They work with a higher ed tech company as well. As a result of that student project, and we ended up teaching the first course from Virginia Tech to incarcerated students, a humanities class, that's what we started with. They were able to get the Department of Corrections of Virginia to meet with this tech company that provides higher ed services, JSTOR, you know them because every library at every university uses JSTOR, Ithaca is that company. For the first time this summer, as a pilot, the Virginia Department of Corrections is going to allow incarcerated students to get access to JSTOR. It'll be an offline version. It's not going to be internet enabled, but they're going to be able to look up articles and write papers and do research. So that was a student project, and it's them understanding technology and society and human rights and how do you humanize people who are incarcerated, because these are humans, these are still people. So that's some of what we're doing is the curricular. We're developing a public interest technology focus that is gonna take some of the research happening within the university and interface it with people who are outside, stakeholders, to try to get to some of these ecosystem issues, because we need new kind of business models, we need new collaborations, we need to build more relationships with institutions of civil society. So part of my role as Associate Vice Provost for Public Interest Tech is to help create those relationships with things like human rights organizations, organizations that are focused on democratic process, international partners that are focused on some of these future human questions about our society. We're really good at partnerships and relationships with DARPA or with manufacturing companies or companies trying to hire engineers, and that's important, and we need to do those things. But if you ask us how many relationships we have with institutions of civil society, we don't really have a lot there, and we can't walk into this future that way. We've got to build out those relationships, and so those are some of the things that are happening.
Do we still have time? Okay. That was an absolutely amazing and thought-provoking presentation. I really learned a lot, and I'm just kind of thinking out loud. So I came a little late, so pardon me if I'm asking a question that you already talked about early on. When you talk about public interest, it seems to be on a collision course with geopolitics today, right? So when you talk of monetization of the public, the private, and society at large, and then you put in ethical governance, does it have to be nuanced to the regional level rather than a global level, recognizing humanity and technology are global, but policies are local?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Absolutely, absolutely. I love your point about the question of the collision course with geopolitics. Absolutely. So part of this gets back to the first question about if we think back to the history of governing the internet and we think about what's in front of us now, what lessons can we draw on that history and what do we need to do differently? And this is one thing that needs to happen differently. There needs to be a lot more local input, not only into policy, but also control of resources. So one of the faculty at Virginia Tech is doing work on indigenous communities in Mexico that are building their own wireless service in those indigenous communities. They own the equipment. They share in that community the cost of running a wireless service. They're in a rural area. They can't just rely on some centralized service anyhow. And because they share the cost, they control the equipment, and they get the communal benefit. It offers them access to connectivity, but it's not some big company that's controlling all the terms. And that's not against, we need big companies. If big companies went away tomorrow, it's not like, oh, the world's better. It's like, no, lots of people suddenly don't have service. Is that we also need, in addition to these big things, we also need local small things. And they shouldn't be pitted against each other. So this is absolutely important question. It does. I think that the geopolitics aspect of this particularly is only going to become more urgent for us as academic institutions to focus on. And I'm just going to repeat something I said earlier about corporations and academic institutions. And I really mean this. It sounds weird, strange, but there is a lot of pressure that's coming down the pike and is going to increase to imagine the nature of our work as universities in the United States against X. And I don't even need to say the countries, you know who they are, right? And I'll make the same point I made earlier. We're on the same planet. And we have to do two things at the same time. Everyone needs national security. That means everyone, all people, doesn't matter what country you live in, okay? And we also need human security. Everyone, all people, doesn't matter where you live. And those are not the same things. And sometimes, depending on how we do it, national security might actually undermine human, when I say human security, I mean things like human rights, civil liberties, food security, those types of things. Depending on how we do them, we could actually put them in conflict if we're not rigorous. But everyone needs those things. And so what I think we cannot do is train people in the US on an aesthetic or narrative of Western dominance. We just kind of assume we're going to be the center of stuff. Most of the world's people don't live in what we call the West. Most of them live in what's called East Asia, South Asia, that part of the world. And we have got to engage, and most of the world's students, you know where they are? They're outside of the West. You know where most of our universities are? They're in the West. So if you cared about nothing but your business model, and you were running a university in the West, you shouldn't even want, you should want more global connectivity and collaboration. But yes, we need local inputs. We need to elevate that. And if we're ever going to get beyond merely re-entrenching the same kinds of inequalities and disparities that run along all the vectors that we're already familiar with, that are geographical and world regional and hemispheric, as well as racial and gendered within states and regions. We've got to not just elevate more input, we have to structure the ability for people at local levels to have more control over institutions or practices of tech. So yes, very good question and spot on.
We have time for one one last question here.
Hi, my name is Lee Marshall. I'm the Director of Research for the School of the Arts at VCU. And I'm interested in where you see environmental justice factoring in or intersecting with the idea of public interest technology.
No, thank you. It was very central to it. We will not be here as humans, and maybe the rest of the biosphere will rejoice because, like, thank goodness they're gone. But we won't be here if we don't change things drastically. We're already seeing the simple things like the severe weather events that are happening. I don't need to name the examples. You know, it's all in the headlines that are due, at least in great measure, to human anthropogenic is a term, but human-caused climate change. Even though there's climate change without humans, the stuff that we're seeing, the human causation is actually a chief factor that we need to change. And this issue of governance, right? How do you manage your technology? So when we're looking at the impact on the environment, even things like very complex neural networks that give us the ability to have something like a ChatGPT, it's consuming massive amounts of electricity. The server farms that are still being built out and are increasing in number are consuming more of that electricity. And so what about the carbon footprint of that? Transportation, right? Fuel, all of this, even our food sources. How are we getting food to market? And I was speaking with someone who works at a major farm equipment company just last week. And he said to me that, he said, in just 20 years, our ability to produce food for the planet will be so far behind the world's population. And there's already a starvation in the world, but a lot more of it is going to happen if we don't change that, okay? So how do you do that? How do you get more output but attend to this? And there's the impact on the environment. So it's really central, and it's another reason why we have to have global, not just nationalist, mechanisms to actually manage this innovation. And it's another reason why we have to have comprehensive opportunities for students, regardless of their major, for students to be able to have some kind of mission-oriented experience where they understand that I be in whatever, English department, chemistry department, doesn't matter what the department is, in terms of this high-level experience that I need. I need to be able to walk out of this university as a student, understanding what are the major problems that we need to figure out as a society, whether I participate in that directly or indirectly as my next step. And over the next 30, 40, 50 years of my having professional life, how is my input in the world gonna tie into those problems? And the answer has to be focused on how do we get the benefit for most people, and how do we storytell so that the way we talk about even humanity, we have lots of the words for this that are trying to get to the entire biosphere or the entire universe, where we can talk about human rights without being anthropocentric, right? Environmental justice.